My name is Lily Farris. I'm 27 years old. And on a Thursday afternoon in Gainesville, Georgia, I sat in a room full of people who share my blood and watched every single one of them become wealthy while I held a folded slip of paper with nothing on it but 10 digits and a first name. My Uncle Douglas didn't even try to hide his smile. My mother pressed her hands together like she was in church. My cousin Brent leaned over to his wife and whispered something that made her laugh into her fist. The attorney kept reading. Numbers kept climbing. And I kept sitting there in the same second-hand blazer I wore to my grandfather's funeral 2 days prior, holding that paper like it was a verdict. They all thought it was. And for about 4 minutes so did I. But here's what none of them understood about that slip of paper. They were so busy counting what they'd been given that not one of them stopped to wonder why Grandpa Earl would leave me anything at all. Even something that looked like nothing. Earl Farris didn't do anything without a reason. He built an entire timber and land business from 32 acres of Georgia red clay and a second-hand chainsaw. He didn't make mistakes. He didn't forget people. And he never, not once in his 79 years on this earth, left anything unfinished. They laughed at a phone number. I picked up the phone. Before I tell you what happened when someone answered, if you've ever been the person at the table that everyone looked past, if you've ever been handed the smallest thing in the room and watched people treat it like proof of your failure, this story is for you. Hit subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. I promise you it ends loud. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Not the will reading. Before that. Because what happened in that attorney's office on a Thursday in October didn't start there. It started the way most things in my family started. At a dinner table with my grandfather at one end and Douglas at the other, and me somewhere in the middle trying not to take up too much space. Grandpa Earl Farris built Farris timber and land over 4 decades, starting with that 32 acres his own father left him outside Gainesville and expanding parcel by parcel, contract by contract, until the operation covered 3 counties and employed close to 60 people full-time. He was not a flashy man. He drove the same Ford pickup for 11 years. He wore the same brand of work boot his entire adult life. And every Sunday morning without fail he was in his back lot by 6 a.m. walking the tree line, checking the property the way a doctor checks a patient. Quietly, carefully, like he was listening for something only he could hear. I know because I was usually right beside him. My mother Sandra is Earl's oldest daughter. She married, left the county, came back when the marriage fell apart, and never quite recovered from either decision. She's not a cruel woman. She's just the kind of person who measures love in comparisons. And for as long as I can remember, the comparison was always the same, me against my cousin Brent, Douglas's son, who had a business degree from the University of Georgia and a LinkedIn profile my mother referenced at family dinners like it was a personality trait worth celebrating. Douglas Farris is Earl's only son. 54 years old, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who fills a doorframe and knows it. He joined Farris Timber straight out of college, worked under Earl for 30 years, and spent the last decade as general manager with the energy of a man who considered the whole operation already his. Nobody in the family ever corrected that assumption. Not my mother. Not my Aunt Renee. Not any of the cousins who showed up at holidays and treated Douglas like the heir apparent while Earl was still alive and still watching everything with those quiet, careful eyes. I grew up in Gainesville. Started 2 semesters at Lanier Technical College before the money ran out, and I didn't ask anyone for help because I already knew what the answer would look like. I manage a hardware supply store on Queen City Parkway now. I know every contractor in Hall County by first name. I know lumber grades, load tolerances, and how to hold a conversation with contractors who underestimate me on site. I learned most of what I know from Earl in that back lot on those Sunday mornings when everyone else was still sleeping. When Earl's health started slipping 18 months ago, fatigue first, then a cardiac diagnosis his doctor said was manageable with proper supervision, I started driving out to the property on weekends. Not because anyone asked. Because he was alone more than he should have been. Douglas was busy running the company. Brent was building his career in Atlanta. My mother visited when it was convenient, which averaged about twice a month. I went every Saturday without fail. I restocked his kitchen, managed his medications, drove him to cardiology appointments in Gainesville when his license was temporarily suspended after a dizzy spell on Route 129. I sat with him on the back porch while he talked about the property, the early contracts, the decisions he was proud of and the ones he wished he'd handled differently. He never once said thank you in words. Earl showed gratitude the way he showed everything else, quietly and only when it truly mattered. 6 weeks before he passed, we were on that back porch at dusk, the tree line going dark against an orange sky, and he looked over at me and said something I didn't fully understand at the time. He said, "Lily, the people who show up when there's nothing in it for them, those are the only people worth building anything for." I told him I didn't know what he meant. He said, "You will." I didn't push him to explain. I wish now that I had, not because the answer would have changed anything, but because I would have had more time to prepare for what was coming. Earl passed on a Monday night in early October. I found out at 6:48 in the morning when Douglas called, not to deliver the news with any warmth, but to inform me the will reading was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. at Crane and Phelps on Bradford Street in Gainesville. He said dress appropriately. Then he hung up. Thursday came the way hard days always do, too fast and too bright. I drove to Bradford Street and found the parking lot already filling up when I arrived. Douglas was there with Brent and Brent's wife Caroline, all three of them in dark clothes that looked purchased for exactly this occasion. My mother arrived with Aunt Renee. Four cousins I barely recognized pulled up in two separate cars. Inside the conference room, Gerald Crane, the estate attorney, sat at the head of the table with a folder in front of him like a hand of cards nobody else could see yet. Douglas took the chair to Gerald's immediate left without hesitating, like the seat had always been reserved for him. I sat at the far end near the window and watched the room arrange itself the way rooms always did in my family, with me somewhere at the edge of it. Douglas received the primary parcel, the original 32 acres plus the main timber operation facility, valued at just over $2 million. He nodded once, slow and satisfied like a man confirming what he always knew was his. Brent received $400,000 in cash in Earl's investment accounts. Caroline reached over and squeezed his hand. My mother received the Gainesville property on Ridgeway Drive plus $250,000 in cash. She closed her eyes briefly and I could see the relief move through her like something being set down. Aunt Renee and the four cousins received smaller distributions, clean and expected. Then Gerald Crane turned the final page. To Lily Farris, one sealed envelope. To be opened only by the named recipient at a time of her choosing. He slid it across the table. Plain white, sealed, my name written on the front in Earl's handwriting. No property listed. No figure attached. No account number. Just an envelope. The silence lasted 2 seconds before Brent said, "That's it?" Douglas, without looking at me, said flatly, "Dad always had a soft spot." My mother stared at the table. Caroline whispered something to Brent and he pressed his lips together to keep from smiling and failed. Gerald Crane said nothing. He simply watched me the way someone watches a door they already know what's behind. I picked up the envelope, put it in my jacket pocket and sat still while the room breathed again around me. In the parking lot afterward, Douglas found me at my truck. He put one hand on the door frame, casual and proprietary like the whole world was something he could lean against whenever he felt like it. "If there's anything in that envelope connected to the company or the land," he said, "you bring it to me first. That's just how this needs to go, Lily." He didn't wait for my answer. He walked back to Brent, said something that made both of them shake their heads slowly and drove away. I sat in my truck alone. Opened the envelope with shaking hands and the afternoon sun coming in through the windshield. Inside, one folded sheet of paper. A phone number. 10 digits. And below it in Earl's careful block print 4 words. "Call when you're ready." I stared at those 4 words for a long time. Then I thought about what he said on that back porch 6 weeks ago. The people who show up when there's nothing in it for them. I looked at the number. I thought about Douglas's hand on my door frame and the way he said how this needs to go. Then I dialed. It rang 3 times. A woman's voice answered on the 4th ring. Steady, unhurried, like she'd been sitting beside that phone for months just waiting for this exact moment. "Lily Farris," she said. "Not a question. I've been expecting your call." Her name was Patricia Weld. She told me that in the first 30 seconds, calm and direct, like a woman who had rehearsed the beginning of this conversation many times and was relieved to finally be having it. She said she was a trust attorney based in Gainesville, that she had worked with my grandfather exclusively for the past 11 years, and that everything she was about to tell me had been prepared, documented, and sealed long before Earl Farris ever got sick. I asked her how she knew it was me calling. She said Earl had given her my number years ago. She said if anyone else had called from that slip of paper she would have known. I didn't ask how. She told me we needed to meet in person. Her office, Monday morning, 9 a.m. She gave me the address on Green Street and told me to bring identification. Then she said something that stopped me cold. She said, "Lily, your grandfather spent the better part of a decade making sure this moment would hold up in any court in the state of Georgia. Come Monday and I'll show you exactly what he built." I drove home to my apartment on Limestone Parkway with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The slip of paper sat in my cup holder the whole way. I kept glancing at it like it might change into something else, like the 10 digits might rearrange themselves into an explanation I could actually hold. They didn't. They just sat there, ordinary and impossible at the same time. That evening my phone started going. First my mother, asking if I was all right, which in Lily Farris language means asking what I know. Then Brent, texting from a number I hadn't saved but recognized from old holidays, a short message that said simply, "Hey, let me know if you need anything." I didn't respond to either. Then Douglas called at 8:47 p.m. I let it ring. He called again at 9:15. I let that ring too. On the third call just before 10 I picked up because I knew from growing up around Douglas Farris that ignoring him only made him louder. His voice was different at night. Less polished. More like the man underneath the title. He asked me directly what was in the envelope. I told him it was personal correspondence from my grandfather. He told me that anything connected to Farris timber and land was a company matter, not a personal one, and that I should understand the difference. I told him I understood it fine. He told me I was making things harder than they needed to be. I told him good night and ended the call. I lay on my couch for a long time after that, staring at a water stain on my ceiling my landlord had promised twice to fix. I thought about the Sunday mornings on Earl's back lot. I thought about the way he walked the tree line. Never fast, never distracted, always like the ground beneath him was something worth paying attention to. I thought about a specific morning 2 winters ago when the temperature dropped overnight and a section of fence along the eastern boundary had come down under the weight of an ice-covered pine branch. Earl was out there at 5:30 with a post-hole digger and a coffee thermos, resetting the posts before any of his crew arrived. I'd pulled up at 6 expecting to find him inside. He looked at me over his shoulder and said, "If you own something, you maintain it. Nobody's coming to do it for you." Then he handed me the other end of the rail and we worked until it was done. Douglas never showed up that morning. Brent was in Atlanta. My mother didn't know the fence had fallen. Monday arrived with the particular clarity that October mornings have in North Georgia, cool and sharp and too pretty for the kind of day it turned out to be. I dressed carefully, found my birth certificate in the fireproof box under my bed where I keep the documents that matter, and drove to Green Street. Patricia Weld's office occupied the second floor of a narrow brick building 2 blocks from the downtown square. No reception desk, just a short hallway and a wooden door with her name on it in plain black lettering. She answered before I knocked, like she'd heard my footsteps on the stairs. Mid-60s, silver hair cut short, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. The kind of woman who looked like she had never once said anything she didn't mean. She shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from her desk and got straight to it. In 2009 she told me Grandpa Earl established an irrevocable trust. Not connected to his will, not subject to probate, not part of the estate. Gerald Crane read aloud on Thursday. A completely separate legal instrument that had existed quietly for 15 years, funded and managed and sealed against exactly the kind of pressure that would inevitably come once Earl was gone. The trust held a land portfolio. Not the original 32 acres that Douglas received. Earl had kept those as a deliberate misdirection, Patricia said, because he knew Douglas assumed the family land was the whole of it. The trust held 11 additional parcels Earl had acquired separately over 20 years, registered under a holding company called Harlan Ridge LLC. Timber rights on 4 of them. 2 commercial properties in Gainesville. A warehouse lease in Flowery Branch generating steady rental income. And a 40-acre parcel in southern Hall County that Earl had purchased quietly in 2019 and that 3 separate developers had approached him about in the years since, each offer larger than the last. Combined assessed value of the trust assets was just over $4.2 million. With the pending developer interest on the southern parcel factored in, Patricia said the realistic number was closer to 6. I sat across from her and did not say anything for a moment. She waited, patient the way people are when they already know the answer and just need you to catch up. I asked her the same question I suspected I would be asking for a long time. Why me? Not defensively. Just honestly. Why not Douglas, who had run the company for a decade? Why not Brent, with his business degree and his career trajectory that my mother recited at every family gathering like a rosary? Patricia reached into her desk drawer and placed a smaller envelope on the desk between us without sliding it over. She said Earl had left a written explanation to be read after I'd heard the terms. She said she wanted me to understand the full structure first so that when I read his words I would understand the context they came from. He walked me through the mechanics. As sole beneficiary, I had 30 days to formally accept or decline. If I accepted, ownership of Harlan Ridge LLC transferred immediately and completely to me. Patricia would remain as a consulting attorney for 12 months at Earl's instruction, available to guide me through every legal and financial element of the portfolio. If I declined or if I failed to respond within 30 days, the trust dissolved and the assets transferred permanently to a land conservation foundation Earl had designated, gone from the family entirely, no appeals, no second chances. Then she told me the part that changed the weight of everything else. The no-call condition, she said, had been built in deliberately. Earl had designed the trust so that the phone number passed through the will with no explanation, no context, no dollar amount attached. Just a number and 4 words. He wanted to know if the person who received it would call out of faith rather than calculation. He wanted to know if they would dial before they knew what was on the other end, before there was any guarantee of reward. Because whoever called before knowing its value was the only person he trusted to handle it once they learned what it was. I looked at the envelope on the desk between us. I thought about Douglas calling 3 times on Sunday night. I thought about Brent's text. I thought about my mother's eyes closing with relief when Gerald Crane read her inheritance aloud, not grief, relief, the kind that only comes from debt. I thought about the way every single person in that conference room on Thursday had known exactly what they were getting before they sat down, had done the math, made the plans, spent it in their heads before the folder was even opened. And then I thought about myself sitting in a truck in a parking lot on Bradford Street, holding a piece of paper with a phone number on it and nothing else, and dialing it anyway because it was Earl's handwriting and Earl didn't leave things without reasons. I reached across the desk and picked up Patricia's pen. Not yet, she said gently. Read the letter first. She slid the second envelope toward me. I broke the seal. 1 page, Earl's handwriting, slightly unsteady in the way it had gotten toward the end when his hands tired quickly. He hadn't written this long ago, said Lily. I watched this family for a long time. Long enough to know who shows up and who sends word they're busy. You drove out here every Saturday for 14 months and you never once asked me what I was going to do for you. That's not loyalty out of obligation. That's just who you are. I'm not leaving you money to spend. I'm leaving you land to steward, income to build on, and the responsibility that comes with both. The family will come for it. They always do. Hold your ground. You know how to read a boundary line. I taught you myself. Earl. I folded the letter. Put it in my jacket pocket next to my phone. Then I picked up Patricia's pen and signed every page she set in front of me. Outside on Green Street, the morning was still sharp and clear. A city bus rolled past. A man walked a dog in front of the courthouse. The world looked exactly the same as it had when I parked an hour ago. But I knew, the way you know things that shift the ground under you, that Douglas Farris was about to find out his father had been building something he never once thought to look for. And that I was the only one who knew where it was. Patricia called me Wednesday morning. Not with urgency, just information delivered the way she delivered everything. Precisely and without decoration. She said Douglas had contacted her office the previous afternoon, identified himself as Earl's son and the general manager of Farris Timber and Land, and requested a meeting to discuss the estate. She told him, politely and without detail, that she had no professional relationship with him. He called back an hour later and asked her directly if she had represented Earl in any trust-related matters. She told him her client relationships were confidential. He told her he would be consulting his own attorney. She thanked him for letting her know and ended the call. She told me this not as a warning but as a weather report. Something was coming and I should know which direction. I thanked her. Drove to work. Spent 8 hours helping a contractor from Oakwood price out framing lumber for a residential build on the east side of the county. The kind of day that asks nothing beyond showing up and knowing what you know. I had been good at those days for years because they were the only kind I'd been given. That changed Thursday evening when Douglas showed up at my apartment. I heard the knock and knew before I opened the door. There's a specific rhythm to the way certain people announce themselves. Not impatient, not hesitant, just heavy, like the knock itself is making a statement. I looked through the peephole. Douglas, alone, jacket on, no Brent, no lawyer. Just him on my landing with his hands in his pockets, which meant he'd come to talk rather than threaten. Douglas with his hands in his pockets was Douglas trying to be reasonable. That was sometimes worse. I opened the door but didn't move aside to let him in. He looked around my apartment from the doorway, the single visible room with its second-hand couch and the stack of industry catalogs on the coffee table and the kitchen beyond it, small and clean. Something passed across his face. Not contempt, something older than that, like confirmation of a thing he'd long suspected. Then he looked at me. He said he knew I'd been to see someone in town. Said Gainesville was a small city and people talked, and if Farris showing up at a law office 2 days after will reading was the kind of thing people noticed. He said he wasn't angry, that he understood whatever Earl put in that envelope felt significant to me, but that Farris Timber and Land was a functioning business with 43 employees and active contracts and a general manager who had spent 30 years building it alongside Earl, and that whatever arrangement my grandfather had made in his final years needed to be understood in the context of a man whose health had been declining and whose judgment toward the end had not always been what it once was. He said all of this the way a man says something he has practiced, even toned, like he was doing me a favor by offering a framework that explained everything away. I let him finish. Then I said, Earl's judgment was fine. And I closed the door. I stood in my kitchen and pressed my palms flat on the counter. The fluorescent light above the sink buzzed faintly. I thought about the word he'd used. Declining. Earl's judgment declining. The same man who had taught me to read a topographic survey at age 14. The same man who had quietly acquired 11 parcels of land over 2 decades without a single family member noticing. The same man who had designed a legal instrument precise enough that Patricia Weld, who had been practicing estate law in Georgia for 30 years, called it one of the most carefully constructed trusts she had ever administered. Douglas had no idea what he was dealing with. That was the thing about people who assumed they already knew the answer. They stopped asking the questions. Friday morning I called Patricia and told her about the visit. She listened without interrupting. When I finished she was quiet for a moment and then said, He'll file within 2 weeks. Probably on grounds of diminished capacity, possibly undue influence. Either way it goes nowhere. The documentation Earl left behind is comprehensive. Independent physician evaluations in 2011 and 2021. A recorded consultation with a second attorney in Atlanta who reviewed the trust structure and confirmed Earl's full legal understanding of every clause. Earl didn't just build this trust, Lily. He built the defense around it at the same time. I asked her what I should do in the meantime. She said keep my life exactly as it was. Go to work. Don't discuss the trust with family. Don't respond to pressure. Let the legal process do its job. When the 30 days were up and ownership transferred, we would notify the family through proper channels, not before. I said I understood. That was the end of the call. Keeping my life as it was turned out to be harder than it sounded, because my life now included Sandra Farris calling every other evening with a different version of the same conversation. My mother is not a stupid woman. She knew something had shifted, couldn't name it but felt the edges of it the way you feel a pressure change before rain. She approached it from different angles on different nights. One evening she called to tell me she was worried about me, that I seemed withdrawn, that she hoped I wasn't letting the will reading affect my perspective on the family. The next call was softer, reminiscing about Earl, about the way he always had a soft spot for me even when others didn't understand it. The call after that was blunter. She said Brent had mentioned that Douglas was looking into some legal matters and that she hoped whatever was in that envelope, I would remember that this family had always taken care of its own. I told her I remembered everything just fine. We hung up and I sat in my car behind the hardware store thinking about what she'd said. This family had always taken care of its own. I turned it over the way you turn something looking for where it's hollow. I thought about the semester I couldn't afford to finish at Lanier Tech. I thought about the 14 months of Saturday drives to Earl's property. I thought about Douglas in my doorway, hands in his pockets, telling me Earl's judgment had been declining. The family had always taken care of its own. What it meant, translated honestly, was that the family had always taken care of Douglas. The following Tuesday Patricia called again. Douglas had retained an attorney, a man named Frank Caswell out of Gainesville, and had filed a formal challenge to the trust on grounds of diminished mental capacity. Patricia said it was exactly what she'd expected and exactly what Earl had prepared for. She filed the response within 48 hours, attaching the physician evaluations, the recorded Atlanta consultation, the 15-year paper trail of Earl's deliberate and documented decision-making. She also invoked the no contest clause, which meant that by filing the challenge, Douglas had now triggered a freeze on his own inheritance. The $2 million primary parcel, the 32 acres and the timber facility, locked in legal hold until the court reached a verdict. His own attorney, Patricia said dryly, had apparently not fully explained that part to him before he signed the filing. I asked how long the freeze could last. She said 18 months minimum if Douglas pressed it. Possibly longer. I asked what happened to Farris timber and land in the meantime, with Douglas's assets frozen and a legal challenge active. Patricia said that was the right question, and that the answer was the reason Earl had included one more element in the trust that she hadn't mentioned yet. She told me Earl had appointed an independent operations trustee, a man named Gil Hartley, a former timber industry consultant who had worked with Farris operations on contract several times over the years and who Earl had specifically designated to oversee day-to-day company management in the event of a legal dispute over the estate. Gil Hartley had already been notified. He had already, as of that morning, presented his credentials to the Farris timber office manager and assumed interim authority over company operations. Douglas, Patricia said, had arrived at the office that same morning to find his keycard deactivated and a letter from Gil Hartley on his desk. I sat with that information for a moment. Then I asked her how Earl had known there would be a legal dispute. She said Earl had told her something when they finalized the trust structure, something she had written down because she wanted to get it exactly right. She read it to me from her notes. He said, "I know my son. He's a good man in the way that people are good when things are going their way. The moment they stop going his way, you'll see what he's actually made of. Plan for that." I didn't say anything for a long time. Outside my apartment window, a mockingbird was working through its repertoire on the power line above the parking lot, cycling through 6 or 7 calls in a row, each one borrowed from something else. I had always liked mockingbirds. Earl used to say they were the most honest birds in Georgia because they never pretended to be only one thing. I thought about what it meant that my grandfather had spent 15 years building a fortress around a decision he'd made about me. Not because he was certain I would need it, but because he was certain they would come for it and he wanted me standing when they did. Patricia asked if I had any other questions. I said just one. I asked when I could meet Gil Hartley. She said he had already asked the same thing about me. We scheduled it for Friday. I put the phone down and looked at the mockingbird until it flew off the line and disappeared over the roofline across the street. Then I got up, put on my boots and drove to work. The morning was cold and bright and mine. But somewhere across Gainesville, Douglas Farris had just read a letter he did not expect, on a desk he could no longer access, in a building his father had quietly made sure he could never own. And the 30 days were not yet up. Gil Hartley drove a 10-year-old Silverado with a cracked side mirror and a Hall County Soil and Water Conservation sticker on the back window. I noticed that before I noticed anything else about him which felt appropriate. He pulled into the Farris timber parking lot on a Friday morning exactly 1 minute before our scheduled time and stepped out in work boots and a canvas jacket, mid-50s, deliberate in the way he moved, like a man who had spent decades in fields and forests and learned that unhurried was usually faster in the long run. He shook my hand the way Earl used to. Firm, brief, no performance. Patricia had arranged for us to meet at the Farris timber office, a 2-story brick structure on Browns Bridge Road that Earl had built in 1998 and repainted himself every 4 years because he said a building that looked cared for told clients everything before they sat down. The office manager, a woman named Donna who had worked for Earl for 19 years, met us at the door with the particular expression of someone doing their job under circumstances they hadn't signed up for. She was professional. She was also clearly paying attention to every detail of how this meeting went. Gil and I sat at the conference table upstairs. Through the window I could see the equipment yard. 2 log trucks, a skidder, a flatbed trailer loaded with timber chain, everything clean and staged the way Earl had always kept it. Gil followed my gaze and said, "Your grandfather ran a tight yard." I said I knew. He said, "Good. That tells me you were paying attention." He opened a folder on the table. Patricia had brought him fully up to speed on the legal situation. The trust, the challenge, the no contest clause, the freeze on Douglas's inheritance. He said he wanted to be direct with me about what interim authority actually meant in practical terms. It meant he had legal standing to manage day-to-day operations, approve routine expenditures and maintain existing contracts. It did not mean he could make major decisions about new development, land acquisition or personnel restructuring. Those required the confirmed owner of Harlan Ridge LLC, which would be me, once the 30-day acceptance window closed and the transfer was finalized. He said we had 11 days left on that window. He then told me something that Patricia hadn't, either because she hadn't known or because she had decided it was Gil's information to share. He said that in his first 2 days of interim authority, he had done a full review of the company's operational accounts and found something that needed my attention before ownership transferred. Over the past 3 years, a series of invoices had been processed through the Farris timber operations budget from a vendor called Crestline Land Services. Maintenance contracts, equipment inspections, survey work, routine line items, the kind that move through a business budget without attracting much notice individually. Gil had pulled the full file. Crestline Land Services was registered in Georgia, established 3 years ago with a single listed principal. That principal was Brent Farris. I sat back in my chair. Brent had been running invoices through his uncle's company. Not enormous amounts, $4,000 to $6,000 per invoice, 12 to 15 invoices a year, but consistent, quiet, and completely invisible unless someone pulled the vendor file and checked the registration. Total over 3 years was just under $60,000. Gil said he'd flagged it for Patricia and for the company's outside accountant. He said the word he would use for it was deliberate. These were not billing errors. The invoice descriptions were detailed enough to look legitimate at a glance but vague enough that none of the work could actually be verified. No site visit records. No completed survey documentation. No maintenance logs tied to any specific equipment. I asked if Douglas knew. Gil said he couldn't answer that with certainty, but that Douglas had signed off on 3 of the invoices directly during periods when the office manager was on leave. Whether that was knowing participation or careless approval was something the accountant would need to determine. But Douglas's signature was on the paper. I looked out the window at the equipment yard again. The log trucks. The skidder. The flatbed. Everything Earl had built, every contract he'd honored, every employee he'd kept on through slow seasons. All of it sitting underneath a 3-year scheme that his own nephew had been running through the books while nobody was looking for it. I asked Gil what he recommended. He said that was not his decision to make and he meant that respectfully. He said Earl had given him interim authority precisely so a decision like this would wait for the right person, who was sitting across from him and had 11 days to formally become the owner before acting on any of it. I drove home that afternoon with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. Different silence than the night after the will reading. That one had been shock. This one was calculation. Brent had always been careful. That was the thing about him that I'd grown up watching and never quite trusted. He was the kind of person who never said anything that could be used against him later, never committed to a position until he knew which way the room was leaning, never let his guard down long enough for anyone to see what was actually underneath it. And underneath it, it turned out, was $60,000 in ghost invoices run through a family business he had never once shown up to help build. My mother called that evening with a new angle. She'd spoken to a family counselor, her exact words, who suggested situations like this often benefited from mediation. She thought it might help all of us to sit down in a neutral setting and work through what Earl had intended. She said she was only suggesting it because she loved me. I told her I appreciated that, and that once the legal process ran its course I would be happy to have a conversation. She asked what legal process. I told her Patricia Weld's office would be in touch within the next 2 weeks. She was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was recalibrating. Then she said she hoped I wasn't making decisions I would regret. I told her I was making the only decisions I could live with and said good night. I didn't sleep well. Not from anxiety. From the specific kind of alertness that comes when you know something is about to move and you're waiting for it. I lay in the dark thinking about Earl walking that tree line on Sunday mornings, the way he would stop sometimes, crouch down, press his hand flat against the ground like he was checking a pulse. I never asked him what he was looking for. He said once that he was just making sure it was still his. I thought I understood that differently now than I had at the time. On the morning of day 30, I drove to Patricia's office on Green Street. She had the final transfer documents ready. 2 notarized copies, a formal letter of beneficial ownership, the Harlan Ridge LLC operating agreement updated with my name. I signed everything at the same desk where I had signed the acceptance documents 2.5 weeks before. The pen was the same one. Patricia said she'd kept it out on purpose. She filed the documents electronically before noon. By 2 in the afternoon, Harlan Ridge LC and every parcel, lease and asset it contained was legally and completely mine. Patricia drafted the formal family notification that afternoon. Certified mail to Douglas, my mother, Brent and Aunt Renee, each letter identical, precise, unemotional, stating the facts of the trust, the completed transfer and the legal standing of all parties going forward. It also included a formal notice regarding the Crestline Land Services vendor account, advising that an independent accounting review had been initiated and that all relevant parties would be contacted through appropriate legal channels. I was sitting in my truck outside Patricia's office when my phone lit up. Brent calling directly. Not a text. A call. I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave one. Then Douglas 2 minutes later. I let that ring too. My mother a minute after that. I sat in the truck and watched 3 calls come through in 6 minutes from people who had laughed at a phone number 3 weeks ago and were now realizing what was on the other end of it. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was something quieter and harder to name, the feeling of ground that has finally stopped shifting, of a thing that has been unresolved for a very long time finally settling into its right shape. I started the truck, pulled out of the parking lot, drove across town on a route that took me past the hardware store on Queen City Parkway where I had worked for 6 years, past the Lanyo Tech campus where I had spent 2 semesters and learned more than I got credit for, and out toward Browns Bridge Road and the Farris Timber office where Donna was still at her desk and Gil Hartley was still in the conference room with his folder open and his cracked mirror Silverado parked in the lot outside. I parked next to him. Walked in. Donna looked up and I told her I would need a desk by Monday. She nodded like she had been expecting me to say it. Gil was packing his folder when I walked into the conference room. He looked up. I told him the transfer was complete. He said he knew. Patricia had already called. He closed the folder, slid it across the table to me and said it was mine now. All of it. He picked up his jacket. At the door he turned back once and said, "Earl talked about you, you know." Not often. But when he did he always said the same thing. I asked what it was. He said she shows up. Then he walked out. I sat down at the conference table alone. Below the window, the equipment yard was quiet in the late afternoon light. The log trucks. The skidder. The flatbed. Mine to maintain now. Nobody was coming to do it for me. I already knew that. Earl had made sure of it. Donna showed me to a desk on Monday morning without ceremony. 2nd floor corner office, the one with the window that looked out over the equipment yard. Earl's office. She said she hadn't touched it since he stopped coming in 8 months ago. The desk was the same heavy oak one he'd had since the 90s, surface worn smooth at the edges. A coffee ring on the left corner from a mug he probably set down 1,000 times in the same spot. I didn't move anything the first day. I just sat in it and started reading. Gil had left me the full operations portfolio. Active contracts, vendor relationships, equipment maintenance schedules, payroll structure, the 2 pending timber rights renewals in Dawson County that needed signatures within 60 days. I worked through it the way I worked through any unfamiliar inventory system at the hardware store. Methodically from the beginning without skipping anything because it looked routine. On the 3rd day Donna knocked on the doorframe, arms folded, and said Earl had told her about a year before he passed that someone was coming who would need to learn the business quickly, and that Donna should help her the way she'd helped him. She said she hadn't known who he meant until I walked in. I told her I was glad she'd stayed. She said she'd never considered leaving and went back to her desk. The Crestline Land Services accounting review came back on the 8th day. Patricia called me with the results in the flat, careful tone she used when the news was significant enough to require precision. The outside accountant had traced $57,400 across 31 invoices over 38 months. Every invoice bore a description corresponding to a legitimate category of work. Not one invoice had a corresponding work order, completion record, field report, or any documentation that the described services had actually been performed. 3 invoices had been co-signed by Douglas during an 8-week stretch when Donna had been on medical leave. The remaining 28 had been processed through the standard accounts payable workflow without secondary approval, which was standard company procedure for invoices under $5,000. A threshold, Patricia noted, that Brent had stayed carefully beneath on every single charge. She said the accountant's characterization was straightforward. This was not ambiguous bookkeeping. It was a structured and deliberate extraction of company funds. She said she had already been in contact with a forensic accountant and that the findings would need to be reported to the appropriate authorities. She asked how I wanted to proceed regarding Douglas's involvement specifically, given that his signature on those 3 invoices created a complicated question of intent. I told her to let the accountant and the authorities draw their own conclusions about Douglas. My job was to make sure the full picture was documented accurately and turned over completely. Whatever came from that was what came from it. Patricia said that was the right answer. I had a feeling Earl would have said the same thing. Brent called me the following Thursday. Not through an attorney, not through my mother as an intermediary, but directly from his own cell phone at 7:42 in the morning when I was pulling into the Farris Timber parking lot. I sat in the truck and answered. His voice had lost the careful, measured quality it usually carried. A man who had been awake most of the night working up to a call and still hadn't decided what to say by the time he made it. He said he knew about the accounting review. He wanted me to understand that there had been a verbal agreement with Douglas about compensation for consulting work he'd done informally over the years, and that the invoices had been his way of formalizing that arrangement retroactively. I let him finish. Then I said, 31 invoices with no documentation across 38 months is not a retroactive compensation arrangement. You know that. He went quiet. Then he said he needed me to consider what this would do to the family. I told him I hadn't created this situation and wasn't going to manage its consequences on his behalf. He should call Patricia Weld if he wanted to discuss it further. Then I got out of the truck and went inside. I told Donna I'd taken the call. She nodded and asked nothing. She'd been at Farris Timber long enough to know that some mornings required that kind of economy. Douglas's legal challenge collapsed in the 5th week. His attorney filed a withdrawal citing insufficient evidentiary basis. Attorney language for the case was never going anywhere. The no contest clause kept the freeze on Douglas's inheritance active until the court formally closed the matter, which Patricia estimated would take another 4 to 6 weeks. Douglas himself called me on a Wednesday evening. No preamble, no warmth in his voice, but no aggression either. He said the challenge was over and he understood the legal position. He said he wanted to talk about the Crestline situation, not about Brent's involvement, but about the 3 invoices he'd signed. He said he had not known what Crestline Land Services was when he approved those charges. He said he'd had no reason to question a vendor that had been in the system, and that his approval had been administrative, not substantive. He said he was not asking me to believe him on his word alone. He said he was willing to cooperate fully with the accounting review and provide whatever documentation or testimony was needed to establish the context of his approvals. What I heard underneath the words was a man genuinely uncertain whether he was guilty of something, who had decided the only way to find out was to put everything on the table. That was different from what I'd expected. I told him his cooperation with the review was the right decision and that I had not drawn any conclusions about his involvement personally. I told him the process would determine what it determined. He said he appreciated that. He said he needed to ask me one more thing. He asked about the company, Farris Timber specifically, not the trust assets, not the land portfolio, but the operating business he had run for 10 years, with its 43 employees and contracts and a name his father had built from nothing. He asked if there was a future for him there. I didn't answer immediately. I looked out my office window at the equipment yard below. The log trucks were out that day, both of them running a haul to a mill in White County. The yard was quiet and clean the way Earl had always kept it. I told Douglas that Farris Timber needed experienced operations leadership. That was simply true. I had been at the desk for less than 3 weeks and I was still reading the portfolio. Gil Hartley's interim authority had a defined end date. I needed someone who knew the contracts, knew the crews, knew the equipment cycles and the seasonal rhythms of the work. Douglas knew all of that. He'd spent 30 years learning it. I told him I was not offering his old title. The general manager position would need restructuring, clear reporting lines, defined authority limits, a formal review process. I told him his application would go through the same process as any candidates. And I told him that if the accounting review found evidence of knowing involvement in the Crestline scheme, that conversation was over permanently. He said he understood every condition. His voice had changed somewhere in the middle of the call, The way a voice changes when a person stops performing and starts just talking. He said, "Lily, I spent 30 years thinking this company was going to be mine. I want you to know I understand now why it isn't." I didn't say anything to that. Not because I didn't have a response, but because some things don't need one. They just need to be heard and let sit. My mother showed up at the Farris Timber office on a Friday afternoon in November, 3 weeks after the transfer completed. She didn't call ahead. She parked in the lot, came through the front door and told Donna she was there to see her daughter. Donna called upstairs and I told her to send her up. Sandra Farris stood in the doorway of Earl's office, my office, and looked at the room the way she looked at most things, taking inventory before deciding what to say. The oak desk, the coffee ring, the window and the yard beyond it. Then at me. She sat down across the desk, put her hands in her lap and was quiet for a moment. Then she said she owed me an apology. Not a speech. Not a justification dressed up as an apology. Just those words flat and plainly meant. She said she'd spent so many years measuring me against what she thought success looked like that she had completely missed what I actually was. She knew that didn't fix anything. She was saying it anyway because she was 71 years old and tired of being the kind of mother who couldn't say hard things plainly. I looked at her across the desk. She didn't look away. I told her the apology meant something. What I needed going forward was simple. To stop telling people a version of my story that made her comfortable. That was the only boundary I was drawing. She nodded. She didn't make promises beyond that and I didn't ask her to. Promises in this family had always been worth less than actions, and Earl had taught me to wait for those. She stood up to leave. At the door she stopped, touched the doorframe once with her fingertips the way you touch something you're not sure you're allowed to touch, and said Earl used to stand right there every morning when he came in. Said he always looked out at the yard first before he did anything else. I told her I knew. I did it too. She left without another word. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, the front door, her car starting in the lot. The yard was still, afternoon light going long and golden across the gravel and the equipment and the painted lines Earl had laid down himself because he said a yard without lines was a yard without order. I pressed my palm flat on the surface of his desk. Cool, smooth, worn in all the right places. I had a lot of work to do. I already knew where to start. The forensic accountant's final report landed on a Tuesday in December, 11 weeks after the transfer completed. Brent Farris was formally referred to the Hall County District Attorney's Office for review of potential fraud charges. The finding was unambiguous. The invoices were fictitious, the vendor was a shell, and the pattern of billing had been structured deliberately to avoid secondary approval thresholds. There was no finding of criminal intent against Douglas. His 3 approvals were consistent with standard administrative processing, and there was no evidence he had known Crestline's ownership or purpose. The report noted his full cooperation throughout the review as a contributing factor in that determination. I read the report twice, alone in Earl's office on a Tuesday morning with the door closed. Then I filed it in the cabinet behind the desk in the drawer Earl had labeled, in his own handwriting on a strip of masking tape, "Matters requiring attention." Felt like the right place for it. Brent did not call me after the referral. He called my mother, who called me that same evening, her voice stripped of the strategic quality it usually carried and replaced with something rawer and harder to listen to. She said she didn't know how things had gotten this far. I told her I hadn't made any of the decisions that got them there. We stayed on the line for a moment in silence and then she said she was sorry. Not for anything specific, just broadly the way people apologize when the list has gotten too long to itemize. I told her I heard her. That was enough. Douglas went through the formal hiring process in January. Interview panel, skills assessment, reference check. The same sequence Donna had run for 2 field supervisors hired the previous fall. He applied for the operations manager position, 1 level below his former title, and did not ask for special consideration. The interview panel, which included Donna, Gil Hartley in an advisory capacity, and a senior project lead named Marcus Webb who had been with the company 14 years, recommended him. I approved the hire. His first day back, Douglas arrived before anyone else, parked in a regular spot in the lot, not the reserved space near the door that had been his for a decade, and came in through the front entrance like any other employee. Donna told me later he'd brought a box of kolaches from a bakery on Main Street and left them in the break room without a note. She said the crews had gone through them by 9 a.m. I didn't comment on that. I thought about it more than once that day. The 40-acre parcel in southern Hall County, the one with the developer interest that Patricia had flagged when she first walked me through the trust, moved forward in February. 3 developers had approached Earl over the years. I met with all 3, with Patricia and the company's land attorney present for each meeting. One offered the most money. One offered a mixed-use development plan that included 20% workforce housing. One offered a smaller number but a timeline that kept the land in active use rather than sitting idle through a multi-year approval process. I chose the second one. Not because Earl would have told me to, he never gave me instructions that specific. But because when I stood on that parcel on a cold February morning with the frost still on the grass and looked out at 40 acres of Hall County land that my grandfather had bought quietly and held patiently for 5 years, I thought about what he'd said to Patricia when they finalized the trust. That the person who received it would come forward on their own. That showing up was the test. And I thought about what it meant to steward something versus simply owning it. Earl had built Farris timber to last. He hadn't built it to be liquidated at the best available price. I wasn't going to start now. The developer broke ground in April. 32 workforce housing units, a small retail strip, a community green space along the eastern boundary. The project manager, a woman named Claudette who wore the same brand of work boot Earl used to wear, told me on the first site visit that she'd never had a landowner show up for the groundbreaking in anything less than dress clothes. I told her Earl had taught me that boots were appropriate for any occasion that involved dirt. She laughed and handed me a hard hat. Aunt Renee reached out in March. Earl's younger sister, quieter than the rest of the family, a retired schoolteacher from Flowery Branch who had watched the whole inheritance situation from a careful distance and said almost nothing throughout it. She wrote me an actual letter, handwritten on lined paper, and mailed it to the Farris Timber office address. She said she had known Earl for 76 years and that she had never once seen him do anything carelessly. She said she had watched me sit in the back of every family gathering for 20 years and she had always known there was more to me than the family gave me credit for. She said she hoped I knew Earl would be proud. She signed it Aunt Renee and then below that in smaller letters just Renee, as if she'd decided midway through that titles were optional between people who understood each other. I wrote back. By hand on the same kind of lined paper. I told her that letter meant more to me than she probably knew. 6 months in, I walked the Farris Timber property line on a Sunday morning. The same route Earl had walked every week for 40 years. Starting at the northeast corner post and moving counterclockwise along the full boundary, through the second growth pine on the north side, along the creek bed on the east, out through the open pasture on the south where the grass was still brown from winter but beginning to show the first green underneath, and back up through the equipment yard to the office. 3 miles roughly. Earl had done it in 45 minutes. I did it in an hour because I stopped more than he probably had, not from hesitation but from attention. At the south pasture I crouched down the way he used to and pressed my hand flat against the ground. The earth was cold and firm. Still his in the ways that mattered, still carrying the work of everything he had built and decided and maintained across 4 decades. Mine now to carry forward in whatever ways I turned out to be capable of. I didn't know yet exactly what those ways were. I was still learning the contracts, still building relationships with the crews and the clients and the county officials whose decisions shaped what the land could do. Still learning the rhythms of a business that moved with the seasons in ways a hardware store counter never had to. Still making mistakes and correcting them and writing down what I'd learned in a notebook I kept in the top left drawer of Earl's desk. But I showed up. Every morning before anyone else I was in that office with the window over the yard. And every evening when I locked the front door and walked to my truck in the lot, I looked back at the building the way Earl used to, checking the signage, the gutters, the condition of the lot. Making sure it looked like something someone cared for. As it was. There are things I know now that I didn't know the morning I sat in Gerald Crane's conference room holding a plain white envelope with my name on it. I know that the people who dismiss you loudest are usually the ones most afraid of what you do if you stop listening to them. I know that showing up without agenda, without the guarantee of reward, is the rarest thing a person can offer, and the thing most worth offering. And I know that inheritance, real inheritance, is never about what you receive. It is about what you are trusted to carry. Earl Farris spent 15 years making sure the right person would pick up a phone. He watched his family. He took his time. He made his choice in the quiet, the way he made every decision that ever mattered. I was in that backlot every Sunday because I loved him. Not because of what he had. Not because of what he might leave. just because he was my grandfather and the tree line needed walking and nobody else was going to do it. He knew that. That was the whole point. I still walk the line on Sunday mornings. The frost comes off the grass by 8 and the pines along the north boundary hold the cold longer than the open ground. The creek runs clear when it hasn't rained in a week. The equipment yard is clean and properly lined. The building is painted and the sign is straight and the gutters are secured at every bracket. Earl would find something to adjust. He always did. But I think he would also stop at some point the way he stopped on that back porch 6 weeks before he passed, and look at what was standing and decide it was holding. That was enough for him. It is enough for me. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confire Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.